So yesterday we filed a complaint in the Middle District of Florida over the National Park Service's approval of 70,000 acres of seismic exploration in Big Cypress National Preserve. So the preserve was created in 1974 to protect a bunch of different things, including the headwaters of the Everglades, a bunch of different listed species and sensitive species, and some of the last remaining intact habitat for much of the wildlife in South Florida. And the seismic exploration would disturb the entire area through Big Cypress. About a third of Big Cypress would be affected overall. This particular project is about 70,000 acres. That's roughly 1/10 of Big Cypress in the northern portion of Big Cypress. And the seismic exploration activities would be done by these massive trucks that are about 12 feet wide, have these big plates on the bottom of them, so 7-inch wide, thick plates that they drop on the ground to create the seismic noise that they then listen to with geophones to understand what type of oil and gas might be available below the surface.
So seismic testing is the preliminary step. If they do think that there's oil and gas, then eventually there might be drilling in this preserve.
Yeah, that's right. So there is drilling in the area in South Florida, and there has been since the early 1900s. We don't produce a lot of oil in Florida, and it's really low quality oil. So in fact, my understanding is much of the oil that we produce in Florida is actually exported to Canada for the production of tar sand, or through the production of tar sands. So we only produce about 2.2 million barrels a year versus domestically we produce about 2 billion barrels a year. So it's a small fraction of what we produce overall. And this seismic exploration activity is intended to further investigate what reserves that haven't been depleted might be still available. So it would expand the scope of what's already occurring.
If they do find new reserves of oil and gas, do you anticipate there might be drilling and there might even be fracking?
Yeah, that's the concern, is because of where this oil might be. And we already know that some amount of fracking is already going on in Florida. If you consider fracking being the acidization process, so clearing the bore for the drill and horizontal or directional drilling. So we already know that that's happening. The threat in Big Cypress, of course, is that we're looking for oil now that's deeper and harder to reach, and the technology to be able to get that might involve fracking or fracking-like techniques.
So it's a national preserve. What does that mean legally, and what kinds of wildlife do you anticipate would be affected?
So this particular national preserve was designated with the intention of maintaining some of the existing uses. So it was created in 1974, and at that time there was already some oil and gas exploration, there was already some off-road vehicle use. And so those existing uses were incorporated and are permitted by the enabling legislation. However, that same piece of legislation says that those existing activities can't interfere with the main purpose of the preserve, which is to protect the hydrologic and chemical and biological functions of the preserve, which are serving as the headwaters for the Everglades, which serve as the habitat for species like the eastern indigo snake, the Florida panther, the wood stork, caracara. There are a bunch of different species that rely on the different habitat types that are within the preserve. So when you get into the preserve, depending on where you're at, you're going to have upland areas which support species like the eastern indigo snake, which requires a bit drier land, and the Florida panther, which most of its prey species are just on dry land. But then other areas that the wood stork prefers, or maybe even the caracara prefer, which is a bit wetter. And so Big Cypress is the perfect place that blends all those different habitat types. And it's, even though there is a small amount of oil and gas exploration there now, and even though there is some limited off-road vehicle use, it's pretty much still wild and intact habitat for these species that are encroached now on all sides by urban development.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Florida panther. What can you say about its numbers, about how threatened it is, and how this might specifically impact the Florida panther?
So Florida panther estimates are now up to about 180, and this is a population that has shrunk from its original broad, expansive size across the entire southeast. It's now down to about 5% of its original range, and it's bound in on all sides by urban development. And the habitat that it needs is the type of habitat that you find in Big Cypress, which is this large areas of intact habitat where there are abundant prey species, a lot of places for the panther to roam, and they're very territorial, and so the more land you have, the better, so you can avoid some of the interspecies conflict, which is one of the leading causes of death next to collisions with vehicles. So every year we see more and more panthers being killed by vehicles, which some say is a good sign because that might mean that we have more panthers. You also have to take into account that it also means that we have more people, more cars, and more roads. So conflicts will continue to escalate as we continue to see more people come into Florida. Florida is the second fastest growing state with a population that's expected, human population that's expected to double by 2050 or by 2060. And so we're only going to see more and more people filling into these counties that right now are a little bit less urban. So we have very dense coastal counties, and it's expected that counties like Hendry County are going to be reaching capacity by 2060 because of the spillover from all the other counties in development there. So if you're talking about a county that now supports a vibrant, well, not vibrant, but surviving panther population, the only one we have left, and you're removing all these bits of habitat to support human population, there's going to be nowhere left for panthers to go.
You've talked already about the Everglades and how impacts on Big Cypress Swamp might affect the Everglades, but you're also concerned about how nearby coastal communities might be affected by impacts to Big Cypress. How is that?
I'm sorry, could you restate that, please?
Yeah, in your press release I read that if there are impacts to the wildlife in Big Cypress, it might also have impacts to the coastal habitats. I can't remember exactly, maybe the mangrove swamps in Lee and Collier. Do you want me to take a second to...
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
This is, it says, the noise and disturbance from seismic surveys. A healthy Big Cypress ecosystem is essential to the health of nearby coastal estuaries, which are home to endangered manatees, sea turtles, and countless fish. Do you think that that's a little bit too much of a stretch for this discussion?
No, I mean, I think it's a good point to raise, and it's something that I hadn't recalled from the press release, but the idea that the hydrology of the Everglades is connected all the way up to Kissimmee and through Lake Okeechobee, and when we talk about restoring the Everglades and getting the water right, that means having the land available to have the water pass through naturally and through these artificial systems that we've created, but to get the water south to Florida Bay and out to the estuaries of Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie. And the way to do that is to keep the existing land we have and to not further encroach upon the natural habitats that we have that exist as these excellent, they provide these excellent ecosystem benefits like water recharge and water conveyance. And so by encroaching with seismic exploration and opening up additional oil and gas activities and building the roads to do that and the pads for the oil wells, you're just further fragmenting and degrading existing habitat. And that does have an effect from the center of the state out to the coastal communities.
You've talked about how water in the ecosystem can be affected, but this water also ends up in the aquifer and ends up as a drinking source for humans.
Yeah, and that's a concern that's been going now, since about 2013, when we started to see a resurgence of oil and gas activities in South Florida and the disposal of this water. So part of the process of oil and gas drilling includes a large amount of water to get that well stimulated. And there are these things called deep water injection wells, and that's where you can dispose of some of the wastewater from these drilling practices. And there is concern that when you do that in Florida in particular, which is like a layer cake of aquifer and limestone, that you could see some drift of that waste material ending up in places. And we have seen it end up in places like Biscayne Bay, so it will travel across the state, subsurface, and turn up in another place where it was completely unintended or unexpected. So as we continue to do oil and gas exploration activities, which of course seismic is the precursor to that, you continue to puncture our limestone, our aquifer, those clay binding areas, you might continue to see or start to see more of these problems with water drifting, contaminated water drifting and getting out of its well casing.